In Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, in chapter 6, he has an interesting description of servants of the Lord. And this section, I'm taking it from the Berean Standard Bible, describes the following: through glory and dishonor, slander and praise, viewed as impostors, yet genuine, as unknown, and yet well known, dying, and yet we live on, punished, yet not killed, sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, poor, yet making many rich, having nothing, and yet possessing everything. I want to focus on that little phrase, as unknown, and yet well known. On a recent trip to prison, I heard about a man named Tony Bagley. He's one of these unknowns. Someday we'll meet him. Someday we'll hear the whole story. But I picked up a few details about him, and I think you'll find it interesting. You know, the state of Mississippi was the last state to lift a ban on the sale of alcohol. The Prohibition ended in 1933, but Mississippi was dry until 1966. However, that didn't stop people from being creative. And in a little section of the backwoods near the towns of Bassfield and Prentice, it was a common thing for people to imbibe certain other liquids that gave the same effect. They would drink antiseptic. And of course, there was a famous cough syrup called Hedicol, which was 12% alcohol. And these people really were spurned by the polite society, by the other churches in the area. No one came to visit them. No one shared the gospel with them. And these people, poor, hardworking, unnoticed by the world, living in these little backwood towns and out in the country, they didn't hear the gospel until Tony Bagley came to town. Tony was born in 1946, and he was a logging superintendent for a plywood company. And in his spare time, he would knock on doors and talk to people about the Lord Jesus. Very often he would just show up in his work clothes. But people said that in a 3-county area, if anyone was in need, Tony would soon be at the door. In 1976, when he was 30 years of age, he found a derelict building in the town of Bassfield. Today, the population of this little town in Jefferson Davis County, the total population is 192. But he found a derelict building that actually alcoholics were hanging out in, and he moved them along, and he cleaned out the old building, and he began to preach the gospel there. The Santee Church in Bassfield, it said, saw the salvation of well over 200 people in a town of 192. And he just kept at it, and he kept preaching. And people that nobody else wanted, he knew the Lord wanted. And I heard this story and how it had impacted even some of the prisoners there knew him well, and how he had been an influence on their families' lives. And I just bowed my head and thanked God, not only for Tony Bagley, but for the untold millions of servants of God in parts of the world we never hear about, who faithfully, ploddingly, as unknown and yet well known, carry on for God. And someday we'll hear the story. Their names were never in the lights. They passed on, and the world hardly noticed. But to think of hundreds gathered around the throne of God someday, who thank God for Tony Bagley, a logging superintendent, who took his moments here and there to share the gospel, to care about people, to minister to their needs, and to point them to the Lord Jesus. I speak to many of you, Sunday school teachers, youth workers, people who go out on the doors, hand out tracts, share a word on the job. The world never notices, but the Lord notices. And someday, you'll discover that He used your loaves and fishes to feed multitudes, and you'll be shocked, you'll be overwhelmed with what God has been able to do, with a faithful testimony here and a testimony there, and that I'd be sitting in a room full of prisoners who'd want to tell me the story of a man who had impacted their families' lives and changed a community by the gospel and by being faithful in acting as a servant of God through glory and dishonor, slander and praise, viewed as impostors yet genuine, as unknown and yet well-known, dying and yet we live on, punished yet not killed, sorrowful yet always rejoicing, poor yet making many rich, as having nothing and yet possessing everything.